In 1908, a fire tore through a farmhouse in rural Indiana, leaving behind what appeared to be the charred remains of a mother and her 3 children. Authorities called it a tragedy. Neighbors whispered about misfortune. But when investigators dug deeper into the scorched ruins of Belle Gunness's property, they uncovered something far more horrifying. Beneath the soil of what locals would come to call murder farm, they discovered body after body, dismembered, poisoned, and buried like discarded livestock. The woman they thought had perished in the fire wasn't a victim. She was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and she might have gotten away with everything. Belle Gunness was born Brynhild Paulstatter Sturseth in November 1859 in Selbu, Norway, the youngest of 8 children in a poor stonemason's family. Life in rural Norway was brutal, and by age 14, young Brynhild was already working on neighboring farms, milking cows, herding livestock, saving every coin for a ticket to America. She was tall for a woman of her time, nearly 6 feet, with a broad, powerful build traits that would serve her well in the grim work that lay ahead in 1881. At the age of 22, she crossed the Atlantic, processed through Castle Garden in New York, and like many immigrants, adopted a new name. Brynhild became Belle, and she joined her sister Nellie in Chicago. Belle worked first as a domestic servant, then at a butcher shop, where she honed the skills that would later define her crimes. She was physically imposing, between 200 and 250 pounds, with hands strong enough to wield a meat cleaver with precision or knead dough with care. Surrounded by the blood and bones of slaughtered animals, Belle learned the anatomy of death. In 1884, Belle married Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant. Together, they opened a small candy store. But misfortune or opportunities struck early. The shop mysteriously burned down, and Belle collected the insurance money. Soon after, their house also went up in flames, another payout. 2 of their children, Caroline and Axel, died from what doctors called acute colitis, symptoms eerily similar to poisoning. Belle had taken out life insurance policies on both children beforehand. Then, on July 30th, 1900, Mads Sorensen died suddenly on the one day when his 2 life insurance policies overlapped. Belle collected $8,500. A doctor initially suspected strychnine poisoning, but the family physician who had treated Mads for an enlarged heart overruled the diagnosis. No autopsy was performed. Belle walked away with the money and the freedom to kill again with her growing fortune. Belle moved to La Porte, Indiana, where she purchased a 42-pigger pig farm at the end of McClung Road. Quiet, remote, and perfect for her plans. In April 1902, Belle married Peter Gunnis, a widowed butcher with 2 daughters. But Belle had no interest in being a stepmother. Just 1 week after their wedding, Peter's infant daughter died while alone in Belle's care. 8 months later, Peter was allegedly struck on the head by a falling sausage grinder. The coroner suspected foul play, but without evidence, Belle collected another $3,000 in insurance. Peter's older daughter, Swanhild, was sent to live with relatives, becoming the only child to survive Belle's home. Around this time, Belle discovered a more efficient way to fund her lifestyle: matrimonial ads. Beginning in 1905, she placed personal ads in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, targeting lonely widowers and wealthy immigrants. Her ads were carefully crafted to appeal to men seeking companionship, carrying cash. One ad read, "Comely widow, who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with a view to joining fortunes." No replies by letter considered unless the sender is willing to follow up with a personal visit. Triflers need not apply. The men who answered these ads walked straight into a death trap. Belle would exchange letters for weeks or months, gradually gaining their trust. Her tone was warm, romantic, convincing. To her final known victim, Andrew Helgelien, she wrote, "My heart beats in wild rapture for you. My Andrew, I love you. Come prepared to stay forever." And they did. Many sold their businesses, farms, and belongings, bringing thousands of dollars in cash to Belle's doorstep. When they arrived, Belle welcomed them with affection, served hearty meals, and poisoned their food or coffee with strychnine. As they convulsed in agony, she finished them off with a cleaver or axe, then dismembered their body skills she had mastered in the Chicago butcher shop. She buried the remains around her farm near the lake, in shallow graves or beneath the hog pen, covering them in quicklime to speed decomposition. The victims kept coming. Henry Gerhold wrote to his family saying he liked Belle's farm and needed seed potatoes. He was never heard from again. John Moe, Olaf, Svenhild, Andrew Helgelien answered her ads, all vanished. But Belle's system had one flaw. Andrew Helgelien had a brother, a seal. Helgelien grew suspicious when Andrew's letters stopped abruptly in early 1908. He wrote to Belle, demanding answers. She claimed Andrew had returned to Norway on business. Acel didn't believe her. He threatened to come to LaPorte and search for his brother himself. That terrified Belle. She hired a drifter, an ex-farmhand named Ray Lampher, to work around the property. But their relationship soured. Ray knew too much. When Belle tried to fire him, he threatened to expose her. Belle retaliated by telling neighbors that Ray had threatened to burn down her house with her children inside. And then, on the night of April 27, 1908, the Gunnis farmhouse burned to the ground. When the fire was out, authorities found the bodies of Belle's 3 children, Lucy, Myrtle, and Philip, and Philippand, a headless woman presumed to be Belle herself. But something didn't add up. Belle was a large woman, nearly 250 pounds, but the corpse weighed only 150. The head was never found. Ray Lamper was arrested for arson and murder. But when Assel Helglian arrived in La Porte, he began searching the farm himself, walking the grounds with a former hired hand. Near the hog pen, they noticed soft soil. They started digging. They uncovered a gunny sack with human remains. Then another, and another. What followed was one of the most gruesome excavations in American history. Over several days, investigators uncovered at least 14 bodies, possibly as many as 40. Some were intact, others chopped into pieces. Many had traces of strychnine. Andrew Helgilian's body was found just where Assel suspected, dismembered, buried under quicklime in the hog pen. The story made national headlines. Families across the Midwest came forward with stories of missing relatives who had answered Belle's ads. Thousands of people arrived by train to see the now infamous murder farm. But one question lingered. Was Belle Gunnis really dead? Headless body didn't match her size, and although a set of dental bridges found in the ashes were identified as hers, some believed they'd been planted dripped from her mouth to mislead investigators. Ray Lamfer was tried for murder, but acquitted when evidence showed the children had been poisoned before the fire, meaning he hadn't killed them. He was convicted of arson and sentenced to prison, where he died of tuberculosis in 1909. Before his death, Lamfer made a confession to a pastor. According to him, Belle had murdered 42 men, poisoned them, hacked up their bodies, and buried them. He claimed she staged her own death, murdered an unknown woman, decapitated the body, and escaped as the farmhouse burned. In the days before the fire, Belle had withdrawn nearly all her money from local banks. She vanished without a trace. For decades, sightings of Belle Gunnis were reported across the U.S. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning a man and trying to steal his money. She bore a striking resemblance to Belle. There were no records of Carlson before 1908, but Esther Carlson died before her trial, taking her secrets with her in 2007. Forensic anthropologists from the University of Indianapolis exhumed the body believed to be Belle's. from a Chicago cemetery. They hoped DNA could finally solve the mystery, but what they found shocked them again. The bones in the coffin included remains of children, not just Belle's, more victims, more questions. And the DNA tests were inconclusive. Belle Gunness may have died in that fire, or she may have escaped. To this day, no one knows for sure. But the DNA samples were too degraded to produce useful results. Even a genetic sample provided by a direct descendant of Belle's family in Norway couldn't definitively identify the remains. And so, more than a century later, the fate of Belle Gunness remains a mystery. What we do know is this: Belle was unlike any killer before, since she blended the cold, methodical poisoning typical of female murderers with the brutal physicality and dismemberment more often associated with male serial killers. She turned murder into a business, death into currency. For nearly 2 decades, she financed her lifestyle by luring, killing, and disposing of those who believed they had found love. Belle preyed on the hope and desperation of men who came to America, chasing dreamsmen who saw her farm as a fresh start, not knowing they were walking into a slaughterhouse. Her story reveals the shadow side of the American dream, where opportunity and reinvention can just as easily become a trap. Her crimes unfolded during a time of seismic cultural change, when America was transitioning from a rural, tradition-bound society into a fast-moving, urbanized nation. Many saw her case as a symptom of the moral collapse, threatening to consume old values. But Belle wasn't simply a product of a broken world. She was a predator, deliberate, manipulative, and merciless. The true number of her victims will never be known. 14 bodies were found. Some say 40. Others suspect even more. Her remote property, her efficiency, and her ability to target men with few local ties allowed her to kill without consequence. Each victim wasn't just a name lost to time. They were families destroyed, letters that stopped arriving, and futures that never came. Today, the land where a murder farm once stood is quiet farmland. But the story lives on in LaPorte, Indian Atoll, in hushed tones, memorialized in local museums, and passed down through generations. Children in LaPorte grow up hearing tales of Hell's Belle, the widow with the warm smile and poisoned coffee, who turned a peaceful pig farm into one of America's most infamous killing grounds. Whether she died in that fire or escaped under a new name, Belle Gunness's legacy endures. She proved that evil doesn't always come in the form of monsters or maniacs. Sometimes it arrives as a grieving mother, a promising match, a kind stranger, offering love. Sometimes it sharpens its knives with calm, steady hands. And somewhere deep in the shadows of forgotten history. Her story still asks the question, did Belle Gunness truly die that night in 1908? Or is she still out there, waiting for the next lonely heart to answer her call? Centuries earlier and thousands of miles away, another woman was building her own legacy of blood and terror in the winter of 1610. Amid the snow-covered peaks of what is now Slovakia, royal soldiers arrived at a castle whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. Inside the towering stone walls of Lahti's castle, they found a scene that would haunt even hardened men of war. Mutilated bodies of young women, some still alive, barely strewn across cold chambers. Blood-stained instruments of torture lay scattered on the floors, and at the center of it all stood a woman, noble by birth, untouchable by law, who had turned her ancestral home into a palace of pain. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, and she had just been caught in the act of orchestrating what many would later call the most sadistic killing spree in recorded history. But Elizabeth's story doesn't begin with screams and shackles. It begins with privilege and something darker. She was born on August 7th, 1560, into one of the most powerful families in Eastern Europe. The Bathory name was legendary. Her father, Baron George VI Bathory, ruled vast lands in Transylvania. Her uncle, Stephen Bathory, was King of Poland, Grand Duke of Lithuania, and Prince of Transylvania. This wasn't just wealth, it was dynastic power, power that bent nations. Elizabeth's childhood was spent at Ext Castle, surrounded by unimaginable luxury. But beneath the opulence, something festered. She suffered from violent, epileptic seizures, her body contorting, her eyes rolling back, foaming at the mouth. Some historians believe inbreeding may have damaged her brain. Others say the seeds of cruelty were planted in her earliest memories. In those days, public torture and execution were considered entertainment, and Elizabeth watched them all, learning. She once witnessed a man sewn alive into the stomach of a dead horse and left to suffocate. Unlike other children, she didn't look away. She studied. At age 11, she was betrothed to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a hardened warrior known as the Black Knight of Hungary. At just 13, she is said to have borne a child with a peasant lover. When Ferenc found out, the boy was castrated and fed to wild dogs. The child was hidden, the scandal buried. In 1575, Elizabeth married Ferenc in a grand wedding attended by over 4,000 guests. With it came power, lands, and complete control over her own domain. Her husband, away for long stretches at war, didn't rein in her violent tendencies, he nurtured them. He wrote her letters detailing new forms of torture and sent her weapons designed for inflicting pain. When Ferenc died in 1604, possibly poisoned, Elizabeth was finally free. She retreated to Lactis Castle, high in the Carpathians, where no one would hear the screams. Over the next 6 years, young girls began to vanish, daughters of peasants, then daughters of nobility. What Elizabeth did to them defied belief. According to witness testimony, she tortured her victims with icy baths, spiked whips, red-hot tongs, and blades. She bit off flesh with her teeth. She reportedly drank their blood, bathed in it believing it would preserve her youth. Some girls were covered in honey and left for insects. Others were caged and beaten. One method involved freezing girls to death after soaking them in water. Her favorite tool, a pair of scissors used to slice open faces, remove fingernails, sever genitals. Servants claimed she kept a handwritten ledger, documenting over 650 murders. But it wasn't until she began targeting noble daughters that the crown took action. In 1610, King Matthias II ordered an investigation led by her own cousin, Count Rgy Thurzo, who saw in Elizabeth's fall an opportunity to seize her power and wealth. Over 300 witnesses came forward. The stories they told would make history. Under the cover of darkness, the victims were removed from the castle. Some witnesses claimed to have seen physical evidence with their own eyes: mutilated corpses, blood-stained torture devices, and rooms whose walls were splattered with gore. On December 30th, 1610, Count Thurzo arrived at Cactus Castle with a contingent of soldiers and royal officials. What they found confirmed the worst of the testimonies. According to a letter Thurzo wrote to his wife, they discovered one dead girl within the castle and another barely alive, presumably Elizabeth's next victim. The subsequent investigation uncovered evidence of systematic torture and murder spanning 2 decades. Elizabeth Bathory was arrested, along with 4 of her servants: Draja Sentes, Ilona Sek, Katerina Benica, and Janos Jevery. These servants were charged as accomplices and put on trial in 1611 under torture. They confess to participating in the murders and provided gruesome details of their methods. They described how Elizabeth would thrust burning pokers into the girls' mouths and noses, sew their lips shut, and force them to cook and eat their own flesh. The trial became a sensation across Europe, shocking even the most hardened judges. One servant, forced to witness her mistress torturing a young girl, described how Elizabeth inserted her fingers into the victim's mouth and pulled until the sides split open. Another testified that Elizabeth pressed red-hot coins into the palms of servant girls, watching their flesh sizzle and burn. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Ilona J. Elizabeth's former wet nurse, who admitted to personally killing around 50 victims. She revealed how Elizabeth summoned girls to her bed even when ill, only to slap and bite them, sometimes biting so hard that the wounds were fatal. Jay also testified that Elizabeth kept meticulous records of her victims, documenting each murder. Like entries in a business ledger, the servants were found guilty and executed with the same brutality they had inflicted on others. 3 were burned alive, while Geno's Jevery, the youngest, was shown mercy and was merely beheaded. Elizabeth herself, protected by her noble status, was never formally tried. Instead, she was sentenced to house arrest, confined to a few rooms within Cactus Castle for the remainder of her life. Some accounts claim she was literally walled up, with only small slits left for food and air. Others suggest she was allowed limited freedom to move within certain chambers, but was forbidden from leaving the castle. What is certain is that she spent her final years imprisoned in the very fortress where she had committed her crimes. Elizabeth Bathory died on August 21, 1614, at the age of 54. She was found dead on the floor of her chamber, apparently having passed away in her sleep. The irony was not lost on anyone. The woman who had murdered hundreds in pursuit of eternal youth died a natural, lonely death. She was initially buried in the castle church, but local villagers, outraged by her crimes, threatened to exhume and desecrate her corpse. Her body was quietly moved to her family estate at Ext, where she was buried in unmarked obscurity. Yet, even in death, Elizabeth Bathory's story refused to remain buried. Over the centuries, her legend grew far beyond the facts. Writers added increasingly sensational details that she bathed in vats filled with virgin blood, that she was a literal vampire who never aged, that she practiced black magic and made pacts with demons. Most of these embellishments, created more than a century after her death, transformed Elizabeth from a historical figure into a mythological monster. The truth about Elizabeth Bathory remains fiercely debated even today. Modern historians have raised serious questions about the evidence against her, noting that many of the 300 witnesses provided only hearsay, repeating rumors rather than describing events they had personally witnessed. The investigation was led by her cousin Thurzo, who had clear political motivations to destroy her. The Habsburg court, which owed Elizabeth's large sums of money, conveniently wrote off these debts after her arrest, and her vast estates were divided among family members who had advanced knowledge of her impending capture. Some scholars argue that Elizabeth was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy, a powerful woman destroyed by men who could not tolerate her independence and wealth. They point out that she had supported her nephew, Prince Gabor Bathory of Transylvania, who was in conflict with the ruling Habsburgs, potentially making her a political liability. Her refusal to remarry after her husband's death, unusual for a woman of her era, may have further threatened the established order. Moreover, the confessions of her servants, extracted under torture, would be considered unreliable by modern legal standards. No alleged registry of victims was ever found, despite extensive searches. And most damningly, there are no surviving formal complaints against Elizabeth, a remarkable fact in an age when even minor noble disputes were meticulously documented. However, the conspiracy theory has its own issues. Letters written as early as 1602 by a local priest described excessive cruelty by both Elizabeth and her husband toward their servants. Witnesses reported seeing physical evidence of torture, and bodies were found on her property during the investigation. While some allegations may have been exaggerated for political gain, fabricating such a large conspiracy involving hundreds of witnesses would have been nearly impossible. The most likely truth is that Elizabeth Bathory was indeed guilty of murdering servants and peasants, but the scale of her crimes was deliberately inflated by her enemies. She may have killed dozens rather than hundreds, and many of the more sensational elements, such as bloodbathing rituals, were probably added later to enhance her dark legend. Even a conservative reading of the evidence suggests she was responsible for multiple murders, making her one of history's most prolific female serial killers. What makes Elizabeth's story so enduring is not only the brutality of her alleged crimes, but what she represented in an era when women had limited power. She wielded enormous authority over life and death, defied gender norms by refusing to remarry, and maintained control over her estates, whether a sadistic killer or a political scapegoat. Her story exposes the dangerous intersection of absolute power, gender expectations, and political intrigue in early modern Europe. Today, Cactus Castle lies in ruins, a tourist attraction, where visitors walk through the very chambers where Elizabeth allegedly committed her crimes. The nearby town has embraced its dark history with exhibitions and souvenirs celebrating the Blood Countess's macabre legacy. But despite all the commercialization and mythologizing, serious questions remain unanswered. Was Elizabeth Bathory truly history's most prolific female serial killer, a woman consumed by vanity and sadism who murdered hundreds for eternal youth? Or was she a powerful woman destroyed by a patriarchal society that could not tolerate her independence, wealth, and refusal to conform? The truth, like much of history, probably lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that Elizabeth Bathory, name has become synonymous with female evil, inspiring countless books, films, and legends for over 4 centuries. She has been called the Countess Dracula, the Blood Countess, and the Lady of Cactus. Her story is said to have influenced Bram Stoker's creation of Count Dracula. Though scholars debate any direct link, perhaps the most chilling legacy of Elizabeth Bathory is not the question of her guilt or innocence, but the fact that in a time when the powerful preyed on the powerless with impunity, her crimes were investigated only after she targeted the wrong victims. For years, possibly decades, young women vanished into Cactus Castle Land. No one with authority cared enough to stop it. Only when noble daughters began to die did justice finally take action. Elizabeth Bathory died nearly 400 years ago, but her story continues to fascinate and horrify because it reveals uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and the expendability of the powerless. Whether monster or victim, her legend remains a dark reminder of what happens when absolute power meets absolute corruption, and when society values some lives far more than others. In the end, Elizabeth achieved a kind of immortality, not the eternal youth she sought, but a lasting cautionary tale about unchecked power and the fragility of truth when history is written by those in control. When Charles Cullen administered the drug for therapeutic purposes, his immediate suspicion was that something malicious was occurring within the hospital. An internal investigation launched by Somerset administrators soon revealed that Charles was linked to numerous suspicious deaths. He was accessing medication dispensing systems for patients who were not under his care, ordering drugs that had not been prescribed, and his fingerprints appeared repeatedly on cases where patients died unexpectedly. When confronted with inconsistencies in his job application, Charles was dismissed on October 31, 2003. Unlike previous hospitals that quietly allowed him to leave, Somerset contacted law enforcement. The New Jersey State Police took up the investigation and quickly realized they were confronting a serial killer who had operated unchecked for over 10 years. However, Charles made a critical error. He had formed a friendship with Amy Wren, a fellow nurse at Somerset, suffering from a heart condition that jeopardized her ability to work. Amy was a single mother, struggling to manage her health and childcare. Charles appeared kind, covering her shifts when she was ill, and helping with her children. To Amy, he seemed a trustworthy friend and competent nurse. But as Amy observed the suspicious deaths linked to Charles's shifts, growing dread overtook her. During the police investigation, she recounted that one patient's death resembled an insulin overdose. Her suspicions deepened, and she came to realize that the man she trusted might be a serial killer. The detectives asked. This was an incredibly dangerous Requescan, a man who had potentially killed dozens and might kill again if cornered. Amy agreed, understanding her cooperation might be the only way to stop him. At a bar in Bridgewater, New Jersey, Amy carefully guided the conversation toward the suspicious deaths occurring on Charles's watch. Charles grew visibly agitated. Finally, Amy confronted him outright, saying, "I know you did it. Let's go to the police station and call them together." Charles's reply was revealing. I can't. He abruptly left the bar. Police, waiting outside, arrested him immediately. While the recording didn't capture a full confession, it provided enough evidence for probable cause. On December 12, 2003, Charles Cullen was taken into custody. He began talking, not out of remorse, but seemingly to bask in the attention. He confessed to killing roughly 40 patients, though investigators suspected the number could be as high as 400. He provided detailed accounts of specific cases, showed maps indicating where bodies might be found, and explained his methods with chilling clarity. Charles claimed that his murders were acts of mercy intended to end suffering. But evidence contradicted this narrative. Many victims were not terminally ill. Some were young and expected to recover fully. His mercy explanation was a facade to avoid accepting responsibility for being a predator who abused the trust placed in him. To satisfy his craving for control and power. During court proceedings, victims' families confronted Charles. Mary Strango, whose 21-year-old son Michael was murdered by Charles, expressed the pain his crimes caused. "My heart aches for my son. It bleeds for my son." She described how Charles had coldly come to the waiting room after Michael's death, looking them in the eyes and delivering the false news of his grave illness rather than confessing to murder. Ultimately, Charles Cullen was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will never be free again and is expected to die in prison. Yet, the damage extends far beyond the lives lost. Families are left haunted, wondering if their loved ones suffered in their final moments, and whether they even realized what was happening to them. The sacred trust between patients and healthcare providers has been irrevocably shattered for many, perhaps. Most disturbing is how effortlessly Charles operated for so long. He was not a criminal genius or master manipulator. He was a deeply troubled individual with glaring warning signs. However, the healthcare system failed spectacularly at every level. Hospitals suspected him but failed to report their concerns. Regulatory bodies did not exchange information. And a culture focused more on avoiding liability than protecting. Patience allowed him to continue. Charles Cullen embodies the worst kind of institutional failure. He hid in plain sight, not due to cleverness, but because the system was designed to shield itself rather than those it served. His case prompted reforms aimed at better monitoring healthcare workers and sharing information about problematic employees. But these changes came too late for his victims' families. Today, Charles Cullen remains imprisoned in a maximum security facility in New Jersey. He rarely speaks publicly, maintaining the same quiet and unremarkable demeanor that allowed him to kill with impunity for 16 years. In rare interviews, he still claims his actions were merciful and portrays himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a calculating predator. The reality is far darker. Charles Cullen was a man who found his sense of power through death. In a world where he felt powerless and insignificant, he became a godlike figure who decided who lived and who died. His murders were not mercy killings. They were sacrifices to his own rage and desire for control. Charles Cullen's story forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, authority, and the institutions we depend on for safety. He was not a shadowy figure lurking in darkness. He was a monster living in the light, smiling at patients and their families while plotting their deaths, exploiting society's trust in healthcare professionals to hide in plain sight. Though not as infamous as Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Cullen may be among America's most prolific serial killers. There were no dramatic chases or theatrical showdowns, just a quiet man in scrubs, roaming hospital corridors like death itself, claiming victim after victim while those around him looked the other way. His legacy is not just the number of lives lost, but the profound betrayal of trust and the grim realization that evil can wear a stethoscope and kill with hands meant to heal. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters hide not in the shadows, but in the bright, sterile halls where we seek salvation. Patricia Font was simply a woman seeking companionship. Yet fate cruelly handed her a meeting with a monster. The reality behind Eddie's actions was far more straightforward and horrifying than his grandiose excuses. He did not kill because his victims were evil, but because their birthdays fit his obsessive need to complete his twisted zodiac wheel. Their deaths were dictated not by their deeds, but by the date of their birth. In 2 trials during 1998, Eddie was found guilty of 3 murders and several attempted murders. He was sentenced to a staggering total of 232 years behind bars, effectively condemning him to spend the rest of his life in prison. Throughout sentencing, he displayed no remorse and seemed unable to grasp the pain he had inflicted. Instead, he interrupted the proceedings with outbursts and continued to claim that he was engaged in righteous work. Now, 56 years old, Eddie Saddia remains confined at Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, where he will likely spend the remainder of his days. His routine involves reading the Bible, sharing scripture with fellow inmates, and folding origami animals. Yet he has never shown genuine regret for his crimes, steadfastly maintaining that his victims deserved their fate. Ironically, the man who murdered for the sake of zodiac signs professes ignorance about astrology. In a 2004 interview, when asked about the zodiac, he simply responded, "I got nothing to live for. I don't have a job. I already got those skills. I could be famous. I could do that. Fame, not divine purpose, moral cleansing, or the thrill of killing was the true motivation behind his actions." Eddie Saddia killed 3 innocent people and left many others traumatized because he yearned to be remembered, to matter, to be more than just an unemployed nobody living in his mother's apartment. In that, at least, he succeeded. But the fame he gained was not the legendary mystique of his idol, the original Zodiac killer who vanished into myth. Instead, Eddie became a pitiful, failed imitator, whose incompetence led to his capture and whose motives revealed themselves as petty and selfish. Survivors of Eddie's attacks still carry the scars, both physical and psychological, from their traumatic encounters. Some, like the deeply religious Larry Parham, have found it in their hearts to forgive him. Others prefer silence, trying to move on without letting that dark moment define their lives. Eddie's story serves as a grim reminder: evil rarely arrives with grand proclamations or clear warnings. Sometimes it hides in plain sight in the quiet young man who attends church every Sunday, calls the police on drug dealers, who seems like one of the good guys. Sometimes monsters are not born from shadows, but from a desperate hunger to matter, to be special, to escape the crushing anonymity of ordinary life. In the end, Eddie Saddia got what he wanted: fame, but fame is a double-edged sword. The legacy he forged is not one of criminal genius or enigmatic allure, but of petty narcissism and meaningless violence. He will not be remembered as the Zodiac killer he aspired to be, but as a pathetic wannabe who threw away his life and others for a fleeting moment in the spotlight. While the original Zodiac killer achieved immortality through mystery disappearing into legend before capture could tarnish him, Saddia became infamous through failure. His flaws and delusions laid bare for the world. In his desperate quest for legend, he instead became a cautionary tale, a stark warning about the dangerous crossroads of mental illness, obsession, and the modern obsession with fame at any cost. On a frigid December morning in 2010, a police officer and his canine partner scoured the dense underbrush along Long Island's Ocean Parkway, searching for a woman missing for 8 months. What they discovered instead revealed one of the darkest serial killing sprees in American history. Hidden beneath the marsh grass, wrapped in burlap sacks like discarded cargo, lay the first body, then another. By day's end, 4 women had been found, all murdered, all discarded like trash along this lonely stretch of highway. What had started as a search for one missing person had uncovered a graveyard. What no one knew that cold morning was that the killer responsible had been living among them for decades. A neighbor, a father, an architect who commuted daily to Manhattan. He was hiding in plain sight and would continue killing for another 13 years before suspicion finally fell on him. Rex Heuermann was born in 1963 and raised in Massapequa Park, Long Island, in the very home where he would later plan his murders. Unlike many killers who come from backgrounds of poverty or abuse, Heuermann had a middle-class upbringing, attending local schools and graduating alongside future actor Billy Baldwin from Baldwin High School in 1981. On the surface, Heuermann seemed to embody the American dream. He earned a degree in architecture from the New York Institute of Technology and founded his own consulting firm, RH Consultants and Associates, in Manhattan. His clients included major corporations such as Target, Foot Locker, and American Airlines. He married Asa Alorup in 1996, becoming stepfather to her son, Christopher, and father to their daughter, Victoria. They lived in his childhood home, a modest residence that would later become central to a horrific investigation. But beneath this suburban facade, something sinister brewed. Heuermann wrestled with chronic financial troubles, owing hundreds of thousands in back taxes, with multiple IRS liens between 2010 and 2012. He was also litigious and paranoid, frequently filing lawsuits alleging injuries from car accidents. Those who worked with him noticed troubling behavior. Muriel Henriquez, a former employee, recalled how Heuermann once tracked her down on a cruise during her vacation, slipping a note under her door that read, "I told you I could find you anywhere." Another colleague mentioned his obsession with control, including keeping hunting photos in his office, which unsettled many. What none suspected was the double life Heuermann led. By day, a devoted family man. By night, a predator prowling Manhattan and Long Island streets searching for victims. His killing spree began in 1993. Though police failed to connect the cases for decades, Heuermann's method was cold and calculated. He targeted women working as escorts, often advertising on Craigslist. These were marginalized women whose disappearances might go unnoticed or be dismissed. He contacted victims using burner phones. Meetings were arranged either near his Manhattan workplace or close to his Long Island home. The sophistication of his crimes was chilling. Horrifying wasn't impulsive. He followed a meticulously refined plan. His intelligence and intimate knowledge of Long Island made him especially dangerous. Investigators later noted his familiarity with the South Shore. Knowing precisely where to dump bodies without risk of discovery. Ocean Parkway, where most bodies were found, was a perfect location, remote, marshy, and seldom patrolled. The four women discovered in December 2010 became known as the Gilgo Four: Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and Amber Lynn Costello. Murdered between 2007 and 2010, each had her story tragically cut short. Melissa Bartholomew, 24, disappeared in July 2009 after moving from Buffalo to New York to start anew. After her disappearance, someone using her phone made cruel calls to her younger sister, calling Melissa a prostitute. These calls were later traced to locations near Hoyerman's home and workplace. Megan Waterman, 22, a mother from Maine, working as an escort in New York, vanished from a hotel in Holtzville in June 2010. Her phone's last signal connected near Massapequa Park, just minutes from Hoyerman's residence. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, disappeared in Manhattan in July 2007. Last seen near Penn Station, blocks from Hoyerman's office. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, vanished from West Babylon in September 2010. Likely Hoyerman's final victim in this killing spree. All four had been wrapped in burlap sacks. A chilling signature of the killer. The careful binding and positioning of the bodies suggested a perpetrator who took time with his victims, deriving sick satisfaction from the ritual of death. As the investigation deepened, more remains surfaced. By May 2011, police had uncovered 10 sets of remains along Ocean Parkway and nearby areas. These included Jessica Taylor, whose dismembered remains were found in 2003 and 2011, and Valerie Mack, whose body was discovered in 2000, but whose other remains were found only in 2011. Most disturbing was the discovery of toddler Tatiana Marie Dykes, age 2, found alongside her mother, Tanya Denise Jackson. The presence of a child added a horrifying new dimension to the already incomprehensible crime spree. Investigators also uncovered a gruesome piece of evidence in Hoyerman's possession. A detailed planning document stored on a Microsoft Word file. It served as a chilling murder checklist. Sections listed supplies like rope, mage cord, saws, and cutting tools. There was a DS section, likely dump site, and a gruesome body prep section with instructions to remove heads and hands. Notes included, next time, ideas and suggestions to try different killing and mutilation methods. The file resembled a business plan. The business was murder. For over a decade, the Long Island serial killer haunted the area like a ghost. The case cycled through 5 police commissioners and generated over 1,000 tips. Yet, the killer remained elusive. Some even question whether a serial killer existed or if the deaths were unrelated. Everything shifted in January 2022 when the Suffolk County District Attorney assembled a new task force dedicated to the Gilgo Beach killings. Using advanced DNA testing and fresh investigative techniques, they finally closed in on their suspect. The breakthrough came when surveillance captured Hoyerman discarding a pizza crust in a Manhattan trash can. DNA from the crust matched material found on the victims. Additional proof came from bottles discarded by Hoyerman's family, which contained DNA matching hair on the victims. Even more incriminating was Hoyerman's Chevrolet Avalanche, spotted near where one victim was last seen. Cell phone data showed his movements aligned with murder times and locations. Investigators also observed him adding minutes to burner phones, mirroring behavior used during the crimes. On July 13, 2023, Rex Hoyerman was arrested on a busy Manhattan street after work, apparently unaware he was being followed. During his arraignment, Rex Hoyerman is a demon who walks among a predator who destroyed families. The psychological profile created in 2011 proved eerily accurate. A white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s, educated, financially stable, familiar with Long Island, likely married, driving an expensive car and appearing unassuming, man-fit. This description perfectly. Authorities found evidence of his obsession with the crimes, revealing thousands of Google searches about the Gilgo Beach case and serial killers. Searches included 11 currently active serial killers and 8 terrifying active serial killers we can't find. At his home and office, investigators discovered old magazines and newspapers with articles about the killings, likely kept as souvenirs. Perhaps most chilling was how Hoyerman manipulated those closest to him. His wife Asa and their children were out of state during each murder, indicating careful planning around their absence. Hair from his wife was found on or near 3 victims, transferred through close contact, making her an unwitting accomplice. The family was devastated. Asa filed for divorce the same month as his arrest, ending their 27-year marriage. According to her attorney, she struggled to believe that the man she married could commit such heinous crimes. By December 2024, Hoyerman faced charges for 7 murders spanning from 1993 to 2010. At each court appearance, he pleaded not guilty, telling the judge, "Your Honor, I am not guilty of any of these charges." Yet investigators suspect there may be more victims. The case has reopened cold trails and given hope to families of missing women who pray their loved ones might be found among the remains. The investigation also exposed decades of corruption and mismanagement within the Suffolk County Police Department, which may have allowed Hoyerman to continue killing undetected. Rex. Hoyerman's story confronts us with a harsh truth about evil. It is not always a creature of shadows or an outcast from society. He coached his daughter's soccer team, fixed neighbors' computers, smiled, and waved as he left for work each morning in Manhattan. As a criminologist remarked in 2011, he can walk into a room and seem like your average Joe. He must be persuasive and rational enough to convince these women to meet him. For over 30 years, Rex Hoyerman lived among Long Island families, many unaware the monster they feared was right next door. He attended the same schools, shopped in the same stores, and walked the same streets as his victims and their families. He was, in every sense, hiding in plain sight. This case is a sobering reminder that evil doesn't always come with warning signs or dramatic revelations. Sometimes it wears the mask of respectability, carries a briefcase to work, and returns home for dinner. Sometimes the monster next door is just the man next door. And perhaps the most terrifying thought: if Rex Hoyerman could evade detection for over 3 decades while living a seemingly normal life, how many other monsters walk unseen among us, waiting for the moment to reveal their true nature? The murders haunting Atlanta did not finally break into the white press headlines until the brutal killing of Sadie Hawley on July 11th. Hawley, a laundry worker, was found nearly decapitated, her skull fractured by a devastating blow. The savage nature of her death, combined with the rising number of victims, forced the white media to acknowledge what Atlanta's black community had long feared. A serial killer was prowling the city streets. Newspapers began drawing grim parallels to London's infamous Jack the Ripper, noting similarities in the method of killing and the surgical precision of the throat slashes. The Atlanta Journal described the killer as a black butcher terrorizing the city, while other outlets speculated the murderer possessed anatomical knowledge due to the exactness of the cuts. By late 1911, the pattern had become unmistakable. All the victims were young black women, slain in the same horrific fashion and discovered in comparable locations found near railroad tracks. This suggested the killer exploited the rail system to move around Atlanta and dispose of bodies discreetly. Some victims showed evidence of being moved post-mortem, indicating the killer likely had access to a vehicle or other means of transport. The timing of the murders was also significant. Most occurred on Saturday nights. This allowed the killer to move through the bustling entertainment districts unnoticed, implying intimate knowledge of the city's rhythms and an understanding of when and where he could strike without detection. The Atlanta Police Department's response was marked by ineptitude and racial bias. White detectives showed little urgency or interest in investigating crimes against black victims, often dismissing the murders as the result of domestic disputes or inherent violence within the black community. When arrests were made, they frequently relied on flimsy evidence or blatant racial profiling. Henry Huff became the first serious suspect after being found with bloodstains on his trousers and scratches on his arms. Following a witnessed argument with victim Sadie Holly, despite his arrest and indictment, the killings continued, clearly proving his innocence. Huff spent months in jail before eventually being acquitted. Other suspects included Henderson, arrested simply because he was a black man found with a razor near one murder scene. The police's investigative tactics were so poor they sometimes held multiple suspects for the same crime simultaneously. Unsure whom to charge, the most promising lead came in August 1912. With the arrest of Elton Brown, Brown initially confessed to killing Eva Florence, and investigators believed he could be linked to multiple murders. His wife reported seeing him return home with bloodstains on Saturdays when murders occurred. However, Brown later retracted his confession, claiming he was beaten into admitting guilt. Like others, he was acquitted when the evidence was insufficient. Emma Lou Sharp remained the only person to survive an encounter with the Atlanta Ripper, providing the most detailed description of the killer. She depicted him as a black man, tall or slender, with a strong build and a well-dressed appearance, including a wide-brimmed hat. This description suggested he was not a vagrant or low-level criminal, but rather someone of a certain social standing and means. Some theorized that the killer deliberately spared Emma, Cses, despite his ruthlessness toward others. Possible explanations included interruption during the attack, hesitation due to her youth, or a calculated desire to leave a witness who could spread fear and confirm his presence in the community. The psychological profile emerging from Emma's testimony and the crime scenes portrayed a methodical, intelligent killer, organized enough to evade capture for years, strategic in his victim selection and disposal locations, and cruel in his ritualistic torment of victims before death. The surgical precision of the throat wounds suggested possible medical training or butchering experience. As news of the murders spread through Atlanta's black community, women changed their behavior dramatically. Many refused late shifts or, walking alone after dark, moved in with family members or traveled in groups. The Baltimore Sun reported that few black women were seen on the streets at night, and many service workers refused jobs requiring late hours. This shift caused economic repercussions, as white employers complained about the unreliability of domestic help. Churches became hubs for community organizing. Pastors like Reverend Henry Proctor urged parishioners to share any information and pressured the police to assign black detectives to the case, believing that witnesses would be more willing to trust officers who looked like them and understood their lived experience. The Atlanta Ripper's reign also triggered a disturbing wave of copycat crimes. Case files from the era reveal several domestic murders where husbands or boyfriends mimicked the throat-slashing style, attempting to pass off their crimes as the work of the serial killer. This proliferation complicated the police's efforts to link murders definitively. One such case involved Frank Harvey, suspected of killing Pearl Williams after threatening that if he couldn't marry her, no one else would. Although the murder bore superficial similarities to the Ripper's crimes, investigators eventually ruled it a domestic incident rather than linked to the serial killer. The last confirmed victim of the Atlanta Ripper was Laura Blackwell. In 1917, her murder showed an evolution in the killer's methods. Her clothes were burned post-mortem, a gruesome signature connecting several later murders. This raised the possibility of either a different perpetrator or a shift in the original killer's approach. John Brown was convicted for Laura Blackwell's murder and suspected in 3 other cases involving burned remains or clothing. However, whether Brown was the original Atlanta Ripper or a copycat remains uncertain. The burning of evidence pointed to greater sophistication, possibly signaling a new killer, or the original adapting to evade detection. By 1915, the murders had mostly ceased, though sporadic killings with similar methods persisted into the 1920s. The official investigation was inconclusive. No one was definitively identified as the Atlanta Ripper. Surviving case files are fragmented and incomplete, a testament to both the era's flawed investigative practices and the systemic devaluation of black lives. Modern criminologists estimate the Atlanta Ripper was likely responsible for 15 to 21 murders. 20th century's most prolific serial killers. The case represents more than an unsolved spree, starkly reveals how prejudice can empower violent predators and deny justice to vulnerable communities. The victim's humanity was routinely dismissed. The police investigation was inadequate, and the media's indifference allowed the killer to operate with near impunity. Yet the resilience of Atlanta's black community shone through this dark chapter. Despite the constant threat, families strove to rebuild their lives and demand justice for their lost daughters, sisters, and mothers. Their persistence finally forced authorities to acknowledge the reality of the crimes, even if the killer was never caught. More than a century later, the Atlanta Ripper remains a phantom. Questions linger. Was there a single killer responsible for all these murders? Or multiple perpetrators employing similar methods? Did he have medical training enabling such precise throat slashes? Was he truly a member of the black community, as Emma's description suggests, or a white man disguising himself to deflect suspicion? Most hauntingly, how many other killers like him operated in the early 20th century South, preying on marginalized populations whose deaths were ignored or forgotten? The Atlanta Ripper's story compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, race, and the value society places on human life. His victims were not faceless strangers, but cherished daughters, mothers, and sisters brutally taken from their families and communities. Their dreams and potential were cut short by a predator who knew society's indifference would shield him from consequences. In the end, the Atlanta Ripper succeeded not only in murdering, but in exposing the moral failures of the world around him. His crimes reveal how bias and apathy create fertile ground for evil, and how justice depends on a society willing to value every life equally. Though the killer vanished into history, his victims must never be forgotten. They were more than statistics. They were human beings deserving of justice and remembrance. Their stories remind us that some evils thrive only in the shadows of society's willful blindness. The Atlanta Ripper remains free, not due to brilliance, but because the society that surrounded him decided his victims did not matter enough to be saved. These were not random acts of violence, but deliberate, calculated assaults on an entire community, designed to sow fear and deepen marginalization. In this way, the perpetrator's impact went far beyond the individual murders, creating a legacy of terror that outlasted his active years. The failure to bring the so-called rainbow maniac to justice is more than a story of investigative failure. Exposes broader societal shortcomings in protecting vulnerable populations. When marginalized groups become targets of systematic violence, and when such violence goes unpunished, the message is clear. Some lives matter less than others, perhaps. The most unsettling aspect of the Rainbow Maniac case is how easily it could happen again. The conditions that enabled these crimes, systematic marginalization, police indifference, and societal prejudice, still persist in many parts of the world today. His story serves as a grim warning about what unfolds when hatred finds expression through violence, and when society fails to respond with true justice. The 13 confirmed victims of the Rainbow Maniac were far more than mere statistics in police files. They were individuals with hopes, fears, relationships, and stories abruptly ended by someone who saw them only as targets. Their names may not be widely remembered, but their deaths exposed uncomfortable truths about Brazilian society, truths that resonate even now in the end. The rainbow maniac remains what he always was, a ghost haunting the edges of society. A chilling reminder that even in progressive cities like São Paulo, darkness can thrive when it preys on those whom society deems disposable. His crimes stand as proof that legal equality means little without genuine social acceptance, and that true progress demands more than laws. It demands a fundamental shift in how we value human life. The story of the rainbow maniac is not simply about one killer's reign of terror. It is about the vulnerability of communities pushed to society's margins, about the cost of hatred when it turns violent, and about the enduring trauma that arises when justice fails those who need it most. Above all, it reminds us that the monsters we should fear most are not the ones in our imaginations, but the real predators who walk among us hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the hot, oppressive summer of 1986, Milwaukee's North Side began to bleed, but not in the way one might expect. This was not the swift violence of street crime, or the explosive rage of domestic disputes. This was something else, entirely methodical, patient, a darkness that would haunt the forgotten corners of Wisconsin's largest city for over 2 decades. His name was Walter Ellis, and for 21 years he lurked in the shadows between two worlds. To his neighbors, he was the quiet man next door who fixed cars and kept to himself. But beneath Milwaukee's underbelly, he was something far more terrifying. A predator who understood that the best hunting grounds were the places society refused to look. Walter Earl Ellis was born on June 24, 1960, into a world seemingly designed to break him. One of 6 children born to Loy and Maddie Ellis, his family struggled to survive in the Deep South during one of America's most turbulent eras. When Walter was just 5 years old, his family packed their few belongings and joined the Great Migration north, settling in Milwaukee's North Side in search of opportunities Mississippi could not provide. Yet opportunity and hope proved to be very different things. In Milwaukee, young Walter found neither dot from the start. Something was wrong. While other children played and laughed, Walter seethed. By age 7, he was already known as the neighborhood bully. His sudden fits of rage and violent outbursts set him apart from his peers. Teachers noted his antisocial behavior, his inability to form meaningful bonds, and his terrifying capacity for sudden, explosive aggression. He would attack classmates without provocation, assault neighborhood children over imagined slights, and stare at the world through eyes that seemed older and darker than any child's should. School became a battleground where Walter was both predator and outcast. By 8th grade, his academic performance had fallen so far that he stopped attending altogether. In 1974, at just 14, Walter Ellis dropped out of school completely, leaving behind any pretense of a normal childhood, and stepping into a life soon to be defined by violence. The transformation was swift and chilling. At 14, he was arrested for the first time, charged with robbery and attempted murder. Charges that might have destroyed most teenagers seemed barely to register with Walter. He paid his fine and walked free, already plotting his next move. In the following years, he was repeatedly arrested for theft, each time receiving nothing more than a slap on the wrist, each time learning that the system could be manipulated, that consequences could be evaded. But these petty crimes were just rehearsals for something far darker brewing inside him. By November 1978, at 18, the pattern escalated. Arrested again for robbery, his violence had become more deliberate and focused. He pled guilty and received 4 years probation, a sentence catastrophically inadequate. Walter Ellis was not just a criminal learning to game the system. He was a predator learning to hunt. The 1980s brought new sophistication to Walter's criminal life. In 1981, he was arrested for sexual assault, a crime that should have been a red flag. Yet, in the overwhelmed justice system of Milwaukee, warning signs were often missed. He served just 7 months in county jail, a mere slap on the wrist for what prosecutors now believe was his first serious sexual offense. Released in May 1987, Walter immediately returned to criminal activities, stealing, violating, with the confidence of one who knew the system cared more about processing cases than understanding the individuals involved. But something else was unfolding, something authorities wouldn't uncover until it was far too late. Walter had begun to kill. In November 1988, his criminal career took a new turn. He attempted to carjack a vehicle, assaulting the arresting officer. This parole violation should have landed him behind bars for years. But Walter served only 2 years and was released in January 1990. It was then that he made a decision defining the rest of his life. He joined the Brothers of the Struggle, sophisticated drug trafficking organization engaged in violent territorial wars across Milwaukee's urban core. For Walter, this gang membership was invaluable cover. His presence in dangerous neighborhoods, his late-night activities, and his ties to the illicit street economy, sex work, addiction, drugs saw became explainable parts of a seemingly ordinary criminal life. By June 1990, Walter was arrested again for drug distribution. His extensive record finally caught up with him, and he was sentenced to federal prison in Minnesota. Yet even prison was an opportunity. There, he learned to manipulate the system in ways that would let him evade detection for decades. Most importantly, he became an informant. When released in the mid-1990s, Walter had achieved a remarkable feat for a career criminal protection. Between 1994 and 1995, he was repeatedly arrested for assaulting girlfriends, once injuring a woman with a screwdriver. In December 1997, arrested for attempted robbery, he assaulted the arresting officer again. But his status as an informant shielded him from serious consequences. Charges were reduced, sentences suspended, and Walter Ellis walked free to continue both his informant role and something far more sinister. What authorities didn't realize was that Walter's real work wasn't snitching on drug dealers, was happening in Milwaukee's shadows, where vulnerable women disappeared and died in patterns. Police failed to recognize. The first confirmed victim was Deborah Harris, a 31-year-old woman found strangled and dumped in the Milwaukee River on October 10, 1986. The very next day, 19-year-old Tanya Miller was also found strangled. Both black women, both involved in sex work, and both sexually assaulted before murder, yet to police. These were disconnected tragedies, incidents in a city ravaged by urban decay, drug epidemics, and street violence. The victims were women on society's fringes. Their deaths easily attributed to their dangerous lives. It would take years before anyone saw that the same Redditor hunted them all. Walter Ellis's brilliance was not in his killing technique, but in his victim selection. He chose women living on society's margins, sex workers, drug users, addicts, homeless. These were people the system had already abandoned, whose deaths would attract little attention. Walter knew this intimately. He had spent his adult life in those shadows as a criminal, then informant, always present, never the focus of suspicion. He understood which neighborhoods had minimal police presence, which streets offered opportunity, and most crucially, which victims would be least missed. Between 1986 and 1992, Walter's deadly productivity surged. While providing minimal info, as an informant, he became Milwaukee's most prolific serial killer. On November 28, 1992, 25-year-old Irene Smith was found strangled, her body marked like the earlier victims. Yet police still failed to connect the dots, the gaps between killings, the geographic spread, and victims marginalized, status-blinded authorities to the pattern. Allowing Walter to kill with impunity. The mid-1990s saw both frequency and brutality escalate. Florence McCormick, 28, was found strangled on April 24, 1995. Just 2 months later, Sheila Fryer, 37, was discovered with the same sexual assault and strangulation marks that had become Walter's signature. What chills most is the cold calculation. Behind the murders, Walter did not kill in rage or passion. He hunted with the patience of a professional, selecting victims carefully, disposing of bodies methodically, then melting back into the urban fabric, shielded by his informant status and unremarkable community reputation. By then, Walter had perfected his double life. 2 neighbors in his working class duplex. He was Walter, the mechanic, quiet, helpful, friendly, utterly forgettable, the sort of man trusted to watch children or carry groceries. But in Milwaukee's dark night, he prowled in his maroon 1994 Buick Century, stalking opportunities, understanding street rhythms, exploiting women's vulnerabilities with practiced ease. Psychologically, Walter was a methodical predator, frighteningly clear about his environment and victims. Unlike many serial killers who spiral into chaos, Walter maintained strict control, killing only when perfect, disposing bodies efficiently, returning to normalcy without raising suspicion. June 20th, 1996, brought the murder of Joyce Ann Mims, 41, following the same deadly pattern, claiming 6 previous victims. Still, police treated each as separate, failing to see the signature linking them. This institutional blindness was no mere bureaucracy, but reflected society's deeper prejudices about whose lives mattered. Walter's victims were primarily black. Women involved in sex work or battling addiction, their deaths seen as inevitable consequences of their lifestyles, not crimes warranting thorough investigation. Walter understood this calculus perfectly. Decades navigating the criminal justice system had taught him its rhythms, biases, and blind spots. His victim choice gave him protection no sophistication alone could. For over a decade after Joyce Ann Mims' death, Walter seemed to vanish. But he had not stopped killing, only grown more cautious. In 1998, his informant protection was revoked after new offenses made him too risky to shield. Sentenced 3 years at Oshkosh Correctional Institution for reckless endangerment, Walter used prison time to plan his return. Released in July 2001, he came back with nearly 20 years of killing experience, intimate knowledge of police tactics, and a refined skill in choosing victims unlikely to be missed. On April 27, 2007, with Ron Stokes, 28, was found sexually assaulted and strangled in Walter's signature manner. By then, Milwaukee police began developing advanced capabilities. In May 2009, re-examining cold cases with new DNA analysis, they made a shocking discovery. Murders once treated as isolated incidents over 20 years were all connected. DNA proved a single perpetrator responsible for at least 7 murders from 1986 to 2007, but matching the DNA to known criminals, failed Walter Ellis's samples were missing. His DNA, which should have been collected during incarcerations, was mysteriously absent. The truth revealed Walter's deep manipulation. In prison, he had convinced another inmate to submit DNA under Walter's name. For years, the database held DNA from an innocent man, while Walter remained invisible to detection. Only when police ordered Walter to provide a fresh DNA sample in late August 2009 did his decades of deception unravel. Failing to appear for testing, an arrest warrant was issued. Police searched his apartment, confiscated a toothbrush with saliva traces. Within days, DNA matched Walter Ellis to 9 murders in Milwaukee's North Side, 23 years after his first confirmed kill. The Milwaukee North Side Strangler was finally identified on September 7, 2009. Police found Walter in a Franklin, Wisconsin motel, hiding with his 54-year-old girlfriend, Cses Johnson. She, unaware of Walter's true nature, was held against her will. Evidence that his violence continued even as police closed in at arrest. Walter possessed crack cocaine and drug paraphernalia, life spiraling into the same addiction and despair that had marked many victims. Walter Ellis's arrest shocked Milwaukee's North Side. For over 2 decades, residents had feared a serial killer stalking their neighborhoods. That the killer was the quiet mechanic next door was almost more horrifying than the murders themselves. One neighbor said, "We had no idea what was happening behind closed doors." The statement captured the horror. Walter hid in plain sight, cloaked in normalcy, while the darkness claimed at least 7 lives. His arrest also exposed deeper institutional failures that allowed him to operate so long. 2. Innocent men, Shant Ott and William Avery, were convicted of murders Walter committed. Both served years for crimes they didn't commit, while the real killer continued. The case of Shante Ott was especially tragic. In 1995, informant Sammy Hathaway falsely testified that Ott raped and killed Jessica Payne in exchange for a plea deal avoiding murder charges. Hathaway's testimony was fabricated based on details investigators desperate to solve the case provided. Ott was convicted in 1996 and sentenced to life, serving 13 years before exoneration by the Wisconsin Innocence Project. These wrongful convictions highlighted the same institutional prejudices and investigative failures. Impunity. The rush to close cases involving marginalized victims revealed a justice system more interested in quick fixes than true accuracy. On February 18, 2011, Walter Ellis entered a plea of no contest to 7 counts of first-degree intentional homicide. This plea, while not an outright admission of guilt, acknowledged that prosecutors possessed enough evidence to convict him. It was a cold, calculated choice, perfectly in line with the meticulous and methodical manner in which he had conducted every phase of his criminal life. Just 6 days later, on February 24, 2011, Walter Ellis was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Shackled and stoic in the courtroom, he faced the families of his victims' people, whose lives he had shattered. Mansa Miller, brother of victim Tanya Miller, expressed a mixture of grief and hope, saying, "I pray for him to do what he has to do with his life to make himself a better person." Yet Ellis displayed no emotion, no remorse, and no recognition of the immense suffering he had caused. Throughout his adult life, he had mastered the art of emotional detachment, and even in the face of justice, that facade never wavered. While the sentencing brought a measure of closure for some families, it also reopened painful questions about how many other victims may have been lost to Ellis's violence. Investigators believed he was responsible for at least 9 murders, if not more. Detective Stephen Spangola, who had worked on 2 of the cases, expressed his frustration that Ellis never offered a full confession. "I just wonder about the other cases he was mentioned in," Spangola said. "There are at least 5, maybe 7 more where he's a strong suspect, but we'll probably never know." Walter Ellis was initially incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin before being transferred to the South Dakota State Penitentiary through a prisoner exchange program. For the first time in over 2 decades, he was severed entirely from the streets of Milwaukee, the hunting ground where he had operated, even in prison. Ellis maintained the emotional distance that had defined his life of crime. He refused interviews, gave no additional details about his crimes, and showed no interest in assisting investigators to uncover the full extent of his actions. On December 1, 2013, Walter Ellis died suddenly at a hospital in Sioux Falls from apparent natural causes. He was 53 years old and had served less than 3 years of his life sentence. His death came unexpectedly and without revealing any new information about the decades-long reign of terror that had plagued Milwaukee. The news of his passing elicited mixed reactions among the victims' families. Some felt relief that the man who had caused so much pain was gone, while others were left frustrated that he took his secrets to the grave. Detective Spangola summed up the sentiments of many when he said he would have been an interesting person if he had chosen, like Bundy, to come clean at the last minute, knowing he was dying, and clear his conscience. But Walter Ellis was no Ted Bundy. He had no desire for fame, confession, or psychological insight. He was a predator who had found an ideal ecological niche in the forgotten corners of urban America, exploiting it with cold, calculated efficiency until advances in forensic science and dogged investigators finally brought him to light. Walter Ellis's legacy stretches far beyond the 7 murders for which he was convicted. His case exposed deep systemic failures in law enforcement, highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized communities, and underscored how prejudice and institutional neglect can create environments where predators flourish. The women he murdered: Deborah Harris, Tanya Miller, Irene Smith, Florence McCormick, Sheila Fryer, Joyce Ann Mims, and Ron Stokes were more than statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends whose lives held value far beyond the precarious circumstances that made them targets. Society failed to protect them, and the justice system initially failed to connect their deaths. Yet, their tragic passing also spurred change. The Walter Ellis case led to significant improvements in DNA collection and analysis, better coordination among law enforcement agencies, and increased attention to crimes involving marginalized victims. The Wisconsin Innocence Project's work in exonerating Shantae, Yu, and William Avery highlighted the grave dangers posed by rushed prosecutions and unreliable informant testimony. Most importantly, the case demonstrated that evil does not always announce itself with theatrical violence or glaring warning signs. Sometimes it hides behind the face of the helpful neighbor, the dependable mechanic, the quiet man who fixes things and keeps to himself. Walter Ellis proved that the most dangerous predators are often those who master the art of invisibility, those who understand that the best hiding place is right in plain sight. Today, Milwaukee's North Side continues to wrestle with many of the same challenges that once made it vulnerable to Ellis's predation. Poverty, addiction, and social marginalization still create conditions where vulnerable individuals can vanish without the attention their cases deserve. But the memory of Walter Ellis serves as a grim reminder. Behind every unsolved case, every missing person report, and every dismissed death, there could lie a pattern waiting to be uncovered. The Milwaukee North Side Strangler operated for 21 years. Not because he was a criminal genius, but because he understood the deadly intersection of criminal cunning and social indifference. He knew exactly which victims to select, which neighborhoods to hunt, and which institutions to manipulate. Most chillingly, he understood that a society willing to write off certain people will struggle to recognize the pattern in their deaths. Walter Ellis died as he lived quietly, without drama, taking his secrets with him. But the horror he embodied lives on as a warning about the dangers of institutional blindness, social prejudice, and the insidious assumption that some lives matter less than others. Ultimately, his greatest crime was not just the murders he committed, but the system of indifference that allowed him to do so for over 2 decades. The story of Walter Ellis is, above all, a story about the shadows that exist in every community, the vulnerabilities every society must face, and the terrible cost we pay when certain people are allowed to become invisible. It reminds us that evil often triumphs not through grand gestures, but through relentless, quiet persistence, then that justice delayed can become justice denied, both for victims and the communities they leave behind.